We're looking at faith and gender and how our faith affects our own understanding of who we are and how we express ourselves with regard to gender, one of those really sensitive issues at the moment. Now, this is going to be a series of webinars, and we're very much looking forward to taking these issues forward. And it started off with a book that was edited for Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. It's called Her Faith Matters. Now, what we did is we interviewed a number of women of different faiths, looking at how gender affected their work with regard to interreligious dialogue. And the contributions were exciting and vibrant and full of courageous contributions. So I would encourage you to look this book up. I'm going to hold it up again. Her Faith Matters, and it's available from Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. A link will be put up on the Facebook page after this webinar. So I'd like to turn to our speakers. We have two very interesting speakers this evening. The first we're going to hear from is Alison Webster. I'm going to introduce both of them to you before we begin. So Alison is a Methodist by upbringing and preference. She's worked in Christian social justice for more than 3 decades, including a focus on gender and sexuality, and also has a long stint with the Church of England's Diocese of Oxford. She currently combines 3 part-time roles, how does that fit in, with Modern Church, Sarum College, and Citizens UK. And our second speaker is John Baxter Brown. He is an evangelist and theologian, having worked at all levels of churches and Christian agencies, including working as the youth officer for Churches Together in England and consultant for the evangelism for the World Council of Churches. He's married and has 2 adult daughters and lives in southern England. I also saw, he didn't put this on in his profile, but I also saw that he's a carpenter. So yes, welcome to you both. And I'm very much looking forward to listening to your contributions. Each will speak for up to 20 minutes. Then they will have a conversation between themselves, and then there will be opportunity for the audience to send in questions. So yes, I think we should begin. So can we now turn to Alison? Alison, welcome, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, my pleasure to be with you this evening, and what an exciting topic. Apologies, this may be a little meandering in the sense that it will have quite a lot of personal story and personal experience in it, and I didn't want to kind of shove that into analytical categories too early, because I think those should emerge in the discussion. So I will cover 2 or 3 areas, and then in conversation with John and questions from others, we can maybe pull out and crystallize some points. Also, I've just had COVID, so if my throat doesn't cooperate, then forgive me for swigging water. So the question we were asked to reflect upon, John and I, was what role has what has my faith taught me about what it means to be a woman? Which, when I thought, oh, that's an easy question. And then the more I thought about it, the harder the question became. Because on one level, I could say my faith has taught me nothing about being a woman, by which I mean nothing particularly. If I sit and think, as I was brought up, what message did I ever receive explicitly about my faith and my gender? I would say nothing. On the other hand, if I think, how could I separate out and say, well, without my faith, what would I know about being a woman? I can't do that either. So clearly, I have ingested a lot implicitly about what it means to be a woman through my faith. So that would be my first reflection. And of course, it has to be said that everything is interwoven and interlayered. So culture, family, faith, all the different aspects of who I am, who we are, is interwoven. So you can't just pull out one bit and say, this is the faith bit, this is what I learned. So I will do my best to nevertheless distill from my particular faith tradition what I think I've learned about being a woman and some of the things that that means. So the reason that I said in my introduction that I was a Methodist by heritage and preference is that even though I'm not currently in Methodist terms a member, Methodism is more important in shaping my faith than anything else and any other denomination. And I hold that Methodist identity quite closely to myself, and it's very important. I am a daughter of the Manse, and therefore all of my early years were shaped by Methodism as lived out, particularly by my parents, but also by the churches I was part of. So what's distinctive about Methodism? Well, that's a difficult one, but I want to just read at the beginning the covenant prayer, which many will know, particularly Methodists will know it, because from my earliest awareness, and I was taken to church from birth, really, it was very much that was what Methodism was. So let me read the covenant prayer, and I think you'll see why I've done it, because we'll come back to it at the end and ask some questions about how that looks once you start becoming critical, when you start critically engaging with different aspects of identity. So, I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will, rank me with whom you will. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you, exalted for you or brought low for you. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. And now, glorious and blessed God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you are mine and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant now made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. So let's just hold that in our minds as I take you on a little bit of a romp through Methodism and me and my gender. So kind of three areas really. Firstly, I want to talk about some stories of conscientization. Secondly, I want to address the fact that one of the key things I learned about being a woman was that gender was a binary. Okay, that's the second thing. And thirdly, I want to talk about what it means now that in wider culture and within faith, that binary has been queered and is breaking down. So firstly, stories of conscientization, because when did I even kind of consciously think of myself as female or as a woman? I think other things came first for me in my background. Things happened quite rapidly. So once I became aware of one aspect of identity, I think I became aware of several almost at once. But the first one for me was around class and economics, both domestically and personally. So the first area of political awareness for me was global poverty and domestic poverty. And the first organisations I joined around about 14 were the World Development Movement and Church Action on Poverty, both of which were fairly newly founded. And that would be back in the mid-80s, early to mid-80s. And that's important because that says a lot to me about Methodism at that time and what kind of goes without saying if you're brought up in a Methodist context. And what goes without saying is that economic justice is of paramount importance. It was very important, I picked up, that we were non-conformist. We were not establishment. My mum, who sadly died a couple of years ago, she had a basic cynicism about what I'd call Anglican overprivilege and entitlement. And her favourite word around anything like that, anything sort of upper middle class or establishment, was snooty. The clerical nature of Anglicanism was particularly, if to her, Anglican clergy sat around doing nothing and they had loads of curates running around after them, and bishops expected respect without earning it. All of that was sort of very under, you know, you may think that's got nothing to do with gender, but I think it has, and I'll explain. But there was a kind of proud Methodist history that we embraced. But of course, that included the role of women, and particularly the role of lay women and working class men and women. So lay and female leadership, ordination from, in primitive Methodist terms, very early on, and the link to empowerment and anti-poverty and, you know, trade unions, agricultural unions. I did Victorian church history at school for O-level, so I became aware of all of this, and I was proud. I was proud that I was part of that tradition. And then when I became a little older, I became involved in Methodist youth stuff, which for those of my generation knew that it's kind of divided into the Green and Yellow Methodist Association of the Youth Clubs, which were perceived as less political, and the World Affairs Youth, which was the more political part. And I went to a couple of week-long conferences at Queen's College, Birmingham, in the 83, 84, I think, and was completely blown away by being in a context for a whole week where young people from all over the world came together. Young men, young women, youth exchange programs brought young people from, I remember, the Bahamas, a mixed group of black and white from apartheid South Africa, some young people from Jamaica, from Haiti, and listened to their stories and really relativized my own story in that whole thing. So I became not just thinking of myself, I wasn't even thinking of myself as female particularly at that point. I was very unfeminist at that point, I'd say. But I was learning that there was global inequality, that the kind of lives people had in different parts of the world was not like mine, and there was a lot of privilege that I had. And from that moment, people may remember that 1984 was International Youth Year, and the Methodist Church did a brilliant job of getting young people to deliver everything for that year, including the London weekend, which was the big national youth gathering of 12,000 young people, and to equip me and my friend Jeffers, if he's still out there, I won't say his second name because he might not want to be outed, but Jeffers, who was black young man from London, he and I were charged with leading a discussion event for 500 young people at the Victoria Theatre in London on racism and sexism. And we were sent on a racism awareness workshop, stroke Black consciousness workshop, with the amazing Sybil Phoenix, who was a black woman leader, anti-racist Methodist leader in London at the time. That blew my mind. And then we went to meet a young Methodist woman, very politicized feminist, who was a squatter in Rotherhithe, and she basically conscientized me almost immediately around women's issues and feminism. So that was kind of, all of that happened within the boundaries of my faith community of Methodism. And I owe everything basically from then on throughout my career to that grounding that my faith taught me. Radical, transgressive, and not just the content, but learning to be a young leader. And by that time, I was a student of theology at Cambridge University, and I realized that I may be privileged, but there were other people that are a whole lot more privileged than I was. much more wealthy, much more upper class, public school that I had no contact with whatsoever in my upbringing. All of that stuff was another whole story. But I'm just keeping my eye on my watch because I don't want to get too much into that. And then, of course, my first job was with the Student Christian Movement. So, we're on a CTBI event. Ecumenism is extremely important. As a young Methodist, I was sent all over the World Council of Churches in Canberra. A woman was raped at that conference, a participant. What happened as a result of it was another whole layer of conscientization around, and I mixed with the women's. So I was identifying as white because of all the racism awareness training I'd done. I'd problematized my whiteness. I had become a feminist, and then I suddenly realized there's this whole thing of violence going on and abuse, and the church was dealing with it really badly. Even the liberal justice-focused organization of the World Council of Churches didn't deal with it well. John will correct me, I think it was 1990 or 91. I think it was 91, Canberra. And I went there as a 24, 25-year-old young person. But I didn't feel like I wanted to identify as a young person. I didn't go to the youth things, I went to the women's things. So fast forward then, I'm working for Student Christian Movement, and it's Section 28 era, and it's oppression, horrible oppression of LGBT people, including within the churches. And I came out as a lesbian at that point, whilst I was on the Methodist Church's Sexuality Commission, which met between 1988 and 1990. And that whole overlap of gender and sexuality taught me this thing about gender is a binary and women and men are complementary. Since then, we've developed this phrase complementarian for the more conservative evangelical aspect of the spectrum. But back then, the fact that complementarity was the mainstream understanding of how women and men relate to one another. So to be a lesbian was beyond the pale, really. And that's the point at which I dropped out of Methodist stuff. And also I was still earning my living as a Christian social justice person, but as being part of an institutional Christianity, I was really doubtful about that. I was asked if I wanted to candidate for the Methodist ministry, or when was I going to candidate, by the person who was on the Sexuality Commission, that I was a lesbian, and my friend had just had his career and life scuppered by the fact that he was not recommended by conference for ordination because he was gay. So it's like, why would you ask me that when you know what my sexuality is? And suddenly the women's stuff became problematic because it meant straight women's stuff. And the whole family values, heteronormativity within Methodist women's and ecumenical women's. This was the movement for the decade of solidarity, women in church, women in solidarity with the churches, as we called it, churches in solidarity with women. There was a very definite feeling that to be a lesbian wasn't really okay. And there were certain agendas like movement for the ordination of women that didn't want to have anything to do with the people that were going to bring them into disrepute. So this divergence between LGBT and feminine, women, I won't say feminist stuff within the church, but women's stuff within the church, which was always trying to negotiate this line between women's things which were helpful and useful and the feminist stuff which was a bit too dodgy and a bit too dangerous. So I was kind of on the edge of that as well. So in my last 3 minutes, I don't think all of that is mixed identities and how different identities interact. So I don't think you can, to me, my lesson is you can never just be a woman. I am a white, middle-class, educated, queer woman. And that's all of those things, plus, you know, I'm sure many other identity categories, all of those things interrelate. And so now I think churches have moved on. We're in a different place. I'm very, very grateful for most of that. We still don't integrate anti-racism to the extent that we should. We're still not where we need to be around LGBT equality. But compared with 1987, we're in a very different place. So I think the third thing I want to say now is that we need to be queer, and we need to be transgressive, and we need to be intersectional. And every approach we take needs to take account of all of those things all of the time. Everything, everywhere, all of the time. And I'm going to read the covenant prayer again because I want us to think about how this covenant prayer sounds to Rachel, who was on one of the conferences back in the mid-80s, who was struggling with anorexia. How it might sound to Moise, who was from Haiti, had been in prison fighting his own government, and was a young political leader, Methodist. To my best friend Ashley, who had suffered childhood sexual abuse and was experiencing long-term mental health issues, sadly took her own life 10 years or so later. How does this covenant prayer relate to all of these different multiple situations? Because I think we need, I still love the prayer. It still speaks to me of so many things, but I also think to be queer, transgressive and intersectional, we need to engage with this as with any other faith text or faith resource in a critical way. So I say again, I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will, rank me with whom you will, put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you, exalted for you or brought low for you. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. And now, glorious and blessed God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you are mine and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant now made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Alison. Powerful sharing of that covenant prayer, because you hear it at first and that sounds lovely. And then to hear it again in the light of your story and in the light of these three qualities, queer, transgressive, and intersectional, to hear that covenant prayer again, it's infinitely more powerful. So thank you. Right, so John, we turn to you and asking you the same question. How does your faith speak to your own understanding as, to put it in binary terms, a man? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Alison, for that open and brave narrative that you gave us, which I deeply appreciate, to be honest, if I can be open about that. I'm going to be coming at the question, in one sense, from a very similar perspective as Alison, in that I'm going to come from a narrative point of view. When I started to think about this, the first temptation I faced was to think, okay, well, I can look up in a book and I can trot out the sort of pure doctrinal statements about what it means to be a man. I can tell you what I think is the right answer and give you a series of proof texts. And that did not sit at all comfortably with me. So I'm going to come from a narrative perspective, and I think the narrative is important, as Alison has illustrated so perfectly. But I'm also going to come from a bit of more of a theological perspective, which I suspect, and I might be talking out of turn here, but I suspect it's easier for a white cis male to look to Jesus as the Son and God as the Father and the Holy Spirit and assume that they're all masculine. And clearly with the earthly Jesus, we have that is a justified thing. We have Jesus who is a man. But it's easy for me to assume that God, the Father, and God, the Holy Spirit, are masculine. And over the years, I have come to see that in a very different perspective. And for me, part of my own narrative was I became a Christian on the 6th of July in 1980 at approximately 7:45 p.m. For me, it was a very definite, dramatic experience where I knew at one point that I had not given my life to God, to follow God and try and be obedient to God. And then I knew I had. And there was a whole process that led to that. And one of the most influential parts of that journey was meeting a young lady who lived down the road from my school, quite fancying her, trying to chat her up and being knocked back every single time. But her dad said, I discovered this later, her dad said, well, he's a big, strong guy, he plays in the first 15. We can at least get some work out of him on our small holding before he learns that you're not interested. So I started to go and help around the small holding and found that the family were really interesting. Partly because the family background I had was in some ways quite troubled. My father at times used to get quite violent, not very often with me, but my brother and I remember occasions where he was violent with my mother. He could get very drunk, and sometimes, very rarely, and if I'm going to be brutally honest, I can only remember one occasion where my father was genuinely kind towards me. So I met this family who were Christians, and the reason I could tell they were Christians is simply because they said grace before meals, and that was it. So they weren't forcing it in any way whatsoever. And I found myself actually, despite my somewhat teenage desires towards the daughter of the household, I found myself accepted and welcomed in a way that I hadn't experienced before. Their family as a unit functioned. The people I started to meet through them also had good families. And that was an eye-opener for me, because I started to see that the way of life that they modeled was something that I had always wanted, but I had never been able to express or put into words before. And so I found myself being more and more drawn to the family, to the church that they went to, which was Baptist. But they were coming from a conservative evangelical perspective, so I was converted into that perspective. And so to begin with, my Christian faith was very much, I wasn't a Christian, I was a Christian. And part of that experience for me was this sense of, well, everybody needs to know about this person of Jesus, this extraordinary person. And I keep coming back now, even, you know, what is it, nearly 43 years since I had that experience, I keep coming back to that encounter I had with God in the back of a Baptist church on the 6th of July as being the point at which my life and my purpose in life, my direction in life changed. I would argue quite happily that it changed for the better, but I was also mindful that if it was true, if I actually believed that Jesus died and rose again, that was the most extraordinary news that had to be shared, because it was good news, because it could give somebody like myself, who used to self-harm and all that sort of stuff, hope. And hope, I think, is one of those things that we lack. So looking at this person of Jesus, I found him extraordinary. I believe he's the embodiment of God. He's approachable and accessible. And if we want to know what God is like, the best place we can start is with Jesus Christ. So the incarnation is, in my view, a historical fact, but it's also a profound mystery that even while Jesus was a child in his mother's arms, he was the creator and sustainer of the entire cosmos. He's the image of God. He's a role model given to us as people to follow, but also as a man to follow. And lacking a role model, I remember deciding that I did not want to be like my father. I wanted to be the opposite of what my father was. So finding in Jesus a role model was extraordinary. And the narrative, therefore, this narrative, isn't so much a doctrinal statement, but my own personal reflections on my own spiritual journey, where I try and deliberately use Jesus, as we find in the Gospels, as the example for me to follow. And what I find is it's very different from the toxic masculinity that we find in the culture around us. You know, I quite like the action films. I have the full set of Bond movies. I thoroughly enjoy them. My wife can sleep through them, which I find extraordinary because I'm on the edge of my seat. I want to know what's going to happen. But what we find within something like Bond, or within the Jason Bourne movie, or with actually most mainstream media, is a kind of toxic masculinity. There are traits that are celebrated, and some of those are directly connected to violence. And I think I echo Alison's point there about the inability, or the lack of clarity with which we as a Christian community have actually addressed issues of violence, not only against women, but as important as that is, but also against other vulnerable categories of people. Children, the LGBT community, refugee communities, asylum seekers, all of that. We have failed to address violence, I think, in a holistic manner. But Jesus had something to say about violence. And that was that his whole approach was non-violent. And so I find that the image and the model that Jesus offers is quite extraordinary and is very countercultural to the image that we find of what masculinity should, I quote, be like in the culture in which we are a part. Therefore, I find myself consciously sometimes trying to follow this person of Jesus. I don't often succeed. Sometimes I fail. Sometimes I simply cannot live up to the expectations that I think God has of me, but also the expectations that I have of myself. So, for example, Jesus talked about turning the other cheek. Somebody slaps you, turn the other cheek, about walking the second mile, about forgiving your brother, your sister, about not looking at another person with lust, about not coveting. And those at times are very difficult things to do. A few years ago, I was desperately hurt by a Christian organization that didn't destroy my faith, but it came the closest to it in 40 years to damaging my faith. And that's still a constant struggle to forgive, even though the sort of toxic part of me, the masculinity that I learned from my own father, is to go out and find a way of getting revenge, of setting the table again. Yet Jesus says, forgive, turn the other cheek. So as I look at Jesus, there I find a model, a man who is angry, at times violently angry at injustice, turning the temples over, for example. He is against the misuse of power. He's compassionate, deeply compassionate for the least and the last and the lost, for those on the margins of society, for those who are at the edges, who are not included in the mainstream. I see a man in Jesus who is very aware of power dynamics. He's very aware of the power of evil. He's very aware of the power of sin, but he's also highly aware of the values of goodness and kindness and patience and forgiveness. He's a very intelligent man who can turn the strength and the might of his enemies into their weakness. And I cannot live up to that extraordinary standard that Jesus sets, but I can strive to do so. I can, in the power of the Spirit, I can seek to follow and to imitate this person of Jesus. I need to rely upon the power of the Spirit for that to happen, for the Spirit to support and encourage me, to empower me, to challenge me, and to shape me into the person I'm becoming. And that's been quite a journey. I remember a few years ago when I was helping organise a conference for youth workers, and we had the likes of Robert Baxter coming to talk to us. And the question he asked at that time was, do you know what it means to be white? And looking at the people around the conference room, there were so many who simply didn't seem able to even understand the question. What did it mean to be white was a question that they could not compute easily, because they'd never had to think about what it means to be white. And Robert said that he knows what it means to be a black man in England. Do you know what it means to be a white man in England? And I found that deeply challenging, partly because I realized that I understood something of what he was getting at, and that actually I had just absorbed the sort of cultural racism that exists in the United Kingdom. And so I became much more aware of the privilege of being white and of being male. And as time has gone on, and I've met people from the LGBT community as well, the privilege of being a white, male, cis person. And now, it wasn't always the case, but now I have to admit that my bald head and grey hair gives away that I am now middle-aged, even if my two daughters tell me that I am much, much older than that. I fit a stereotype. And it troubles me that still so much of the leadership that we see in the churches falls into that category: white, male, middle class, highly educated. Unlike Alison, I went to a good university, which is called Oxford. We still fall into that categorization of what it means to be male. And Jesus still comes, in my view, comes against that categorization and challenges it and says actually the values of what it is to be a man are not about power, but about service. They're not about dominance. They're not about leadership. There actually is, Jesus talked about being, whoever wants to be the greatest has to be the servant of all. And the use of power that white, middle class, middle-aged, educated men tend to have needs to be consciously examined all the time to be, so that I can be aware, so that we can be aware of the power dynamics that exist within that, and that I need to make allowances for the privilege I've been given. So for example, one of the things I consciously try and do now within the sort of limited political power that I experience is to try and ensure that I invite younger people, women, people from the LGBT community, and people from a non-white background. I try and make sure that they are represented on the different groups where I have the power to invest in getting new voices heard and getting new narratives heard. Because those narratives are just as valuable as mine. I don't want to degrade my narrative because that is not, I don't think, a biblical or a sensible or a wise approach. My narrative is important, but because I'm a white middle-class male, it tends to be regarded as being of more value. And I don't want to have to pull myself down. I want to raise other people up. And so being a man, to my mind, being a man who tries to follow Jesus, is about creating opportunities for other people. It's about creating space where other voices, and particularly minority voices, can be heard and can be listened to, and can start to shape future policies and future agendas for the church. So for me, it's not, being a man, it's not about a list of rules of you must do this, do that, don't do the other. Really, it's much more about the personal relationship that I have with God, the personal relationship that exists between me and God, but also it's about the personal relationship between my neighbours. And for me, the priority always has to be, working out the relationship between my wife and I, and my children and myself, my wider family and myself, my colleagues and myself, and people near, geographically, people near and far, culturally, people near and far. And that the quality of those personal relationships is perhaps, I think, the most valuable thing that I can contribute as a man. That if people can glimpse something of the nature of God in me, of the kindness and compassion of Christ in me, in the way I try and do things, even when I fail, if they can still see something of that motivation of Christ in me, the hope of glory, then that's what it means for me to be a man in these sort of early days, well, nearly a quarter of the way through the 21st century now. And I wish that there were more white, middle-class males who would consciously try and make sure that those other voices are heard. Because I think too often we miss out hearing on the voice of God when we only listen to the people who are the same as us. So it's a slightly different approach from Alison, but it still has that narrative dimension that I think is vital. And hopefully the narrative, my lived narrative, takes something of the gospel narrative and tries to embody it in a way that other people hopefully will say, there's something more to this Christianity life. There's something real to it that changes lives and that gives even the most broken people a fresh start, to try again and to have a hope and a future. So there are a few of my own quick reflections, which I hope in their own way can contribute to the ongoing conversation about what it means to be a man, a woman, and a Christian in these days. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, John. And again, another sensitive and courageous sharing of your early childhood, and you're searching for something that was counter to the cultural understanding of masculinity and discovering that in Jesus. That's, yeah, quite a story. And both of you, I think, have mentioned an awareness of your own privilege, and also the times when there was a lack of privilege as well, and the real need to ensure that others are also included in that privilege. Right, so now it's time for a conversation between the two of you. Do either of you have a burning question you'd like to ask the other?
I'd love a point of clarity. When you talk about transgressive, Alison, I'm familiar with the term progressive. I'm interested in what you're getting at when you use that term transgressive, because you used it several times. It clearly means something quite important to you. So could you expand on that a bit, please?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting one, John, because what I discovered moving from sort of, for want of a better word, secular queer theory discussions back into theological, or more accurately, church context, was that transgressive was a bad word, or potentially a bad word in a Christian context, whereas in a queer theory context, it's basic to what you're talking about. So, so for instance, I preached a sermon at an ordination service at Reading Minster, where I said, I want, what I would like for, as a lay woman, what I would like from priests is that they are, amongst other things, transgressive. And people heard that, because I think in the Christian language, there's an association between sin and, forgive us our transgressions, forgive us our sins. That hadn't occurred to me that people would see it in that way, but, with retrospect. So transgressive to me is about when you go beyond, particularly boundaries. So boundaries which are unhelpful. So take the binary, the gender binary or the sexuality boundary. To transgress those boundaries is to open them up, to make them porous, to realize that we're not talking about two things, we're talking about a continuum. And to me, you mentioned the incarnation. So to me, the most powerful thing about the incarnation is that it is a transgression of the boundaries between humans and the divine. So it's a positive going beyond boundaries that have traditionally been seen to be crucial to certain understandings of God, humanity, identity. So it's a sort of loosening of identity that you get. So queer is about transgressing the boundaries that split straight from gay, or from male from female. In Christianity, you might say, well, we perceive a boundary between doctrine and action, which assumes that doctrine is somehow determined objectively, and we adopt that or not, or we do right or we do wrong. But actually, so well, if you queer it, you say actually the whole foundation is questionable and doctrine itself is political. And there may be times when you have to transgress the boundaries that have been set by people in power, questioning the boundaries. Why are they there? Who put them there? Whose interest do they serve? So I hope that helps. And that leads me to a question, John, of something that you're I started quite, it's not so much a question for you, but you talk about the relationship, or you highlight the relationship between individual and interpersonal and structural. And I think that's really important around, and obviously in the context of various kinds of power and deployment of power. So that it's always interested me, what is this? Obviously what we do as individuals is important, how we relate to others is crucial, but I think often for churches there's a gap between that and structures and systems, both in society. And so challenging unjust structures, which is one of our marks of mission, because we don't take enough account of power and how it works, we kind of don't know how to do that. We can say, yes, I'm a sinner and I need to do things differently. I need to, as you were saying, John, you're following a role model, you're following Jesus, you're critiquing your own identity and behavior in relation to that that role model. But how does that work when it's corporate? That's a massive question. I don't expect you to answer it, but that's where I'm going. You might have further reflections on, you know, how does interpersonal justice become corporate justice? What are your reflections on that around gender or any other thing?
I think it's a brilliant question, and I'm so glad you asked it. And I really struggle to get my head around a simple answer to it. I think as I look at things, you know, I have a great deal of sympathy, for example, for Justin Welby as the Archbishop of Canterbury, with a position that I don't think is possible to actually for any person to fulfill, because there are so many competing agendas, some of which are contradictory. And so I think, you know, bless him, I am sure he is doing his utmost to try and do his, you know, fulfill his vocation as best as he possibly can. But there are structures around him and there are power blocks around him that no matter what he does is not going to satisfy all those different agendas. And I think that boils down to all different levels. So one of the things I put on Facebook not so long ago was how quick we are in an attempt to remain doctrinally pure to sacrifice unity. And I've moved from the conservative evangelical starting point 43 years ago to think that relationships are much more valuable than doctrinal purity. And one of the things that the WCC did last year, for example, at their assembly, was invite the Russian Orthodox Church to be part of that, alongside the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the other Orthodox churches. Not because it would be seen as in any way condoning the war and the aggression of Russia, but because people actually do need a place to talk. Then that needs to exist somewhere. And the WCC, I think, were very brave to try and create a space where the Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox churches could talk to one another in a safe place. It doesn't resolve the issue. It doesn't give an answer to how you can take the personal relationships and change the structural dynamics from them. But what it does do is open up a crack where other people might come through. And years ago, I was able to go to the Lausanne conference in Cape Town in 2010 as a ecumenical representative. And one of the trips I did was to Robben Island to see where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for all those years. It was a deeply emotive experience, partly because, you know, obviously Mandela has developed into some form of mythic figure, and it's an extraordinary story of forgiveness and of power dynamics. And the guides were all previous inmates, and the guide that we had on our tour was really entertaining. He was had a very good sense of humor, but also could slip into the humorous presentation some very profound comments. And he asked people where they lived. I said Switzerland. He said, "Is that a Swiss watch on your wrist?" And I said, "Yes, because it was a cheap swatch." So it wasn't exactly valuable. It was just a lovely watch. I enjoyed it. And he talked about the time where the WCC was leading a campaign for literacy development within the prison. And so he was actually there talking about the organization I was working for. And that gave me sort of goosebump moment of so much of what we try and strive to do doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. Except then there's a case where something that had happened years before made such an impact on that particular prisoner that he sang the praises of the World Council of Churches. So at the end of the presentation, I gave him the watch, and he was really touched that one would make that gesture. But in my thinking, it was just a tiny response to the incredible gesture, the gift that he had given me and the colleagues I was with on that day by talking about their experience and how clearly some of that had shaped Mandela, and Mandela went on to do such great things. So the personal relationships I do think are important, because potentially sometimes they're the keys that open up very significant doors. And we can't tell what doors our kindness and our charitableness and our forgiveness will open up for somebody else. We just cannot predict that. And therefore we've just got to be wantonly generous with kindness.
Thank you, John. You mentioned personal relationships. I mean, it's both with the family that you got to know as a teenager, and also with this person that you just met in South Africa. We've got one question coming through, but I'd like to emphasize to anyone who's out there that if you'd like to send through a question, it can be put on the Q&A. It's a little icon along the bottom of the screen. Do send through a question, but we do have one here. Oops, I need to draw it back up. How, I think this is for both of you. Maybe Alison, you could speak first about how do we challenge the theologies of toxic masculinity within the church? That's something you could write a whole PhD on, but give it a go.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big question. And I suppose one of my reflections is how little we have done. And when I say we, I'm not quite sure who I mean. But when I remember when I worked for Student Christian Movement, which was from 1987 to 1990, so that's a long time ago. There was a women's network where we did feminist stuff, and the men in SCM at the time decided they wanted a men's network. Not from the point of view of, oh, you've got one, so we've got one, but for precisely that reason, to say exactly as we say, we need to reflect on our white privilege as white people. That was an attempt by them to reflect on their male privilege as young men within the SCM at that time. And, you know, interestingly, one of the people I think was involved in that is now living in the USA and has just brought out, Richard Reeves has just brought out a book on masculinity. But there's not that many. There was, you know, there's James Nelson's work, The Intimate Connection. There's, I think, feminist critiques of liberation theology, Marcella Althaus-Reid, who interrogate the whole thing about machismo in Latin American culture. But on the whole, I don't think theologically, I may be wrong, I may be missing something. There's Mark Price, who did some brilliant work here. And, you know, again, I think it's gay men who often see more clearly the damage that is done by negative forms of masculinity. But yeah, I definitely, you know, if you're thinking in church terms, it's probably been done under the radar in the whole issue around gender and power, most obviously in the Church of England, because that's where the most obvious contention has been around women's ordination and since, and the work of Watch. So it gets pointed up at particular points in time, but how much that has reshaped, for instance, ideas of leadership. I mean, John talked quite a lot about leadership, about having diverse, much more diverse leadership. And maybe we've focused more on gender to the exclusion of things like class and race it's in really the last 3-4 years that the Church of England has really started to make any progress whatsoever around its colonial past and what that means for models of leadership within the Church of England now, both white and male. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think. But again, it's need to do these things together, because if you just focus on that's what we've learned over the last 40 years of my life. If you just focus on, well, I'll just do feminist stuff for a bit, and then you look up and there's this whole thing, damage that you've done by not taking account of the other things and not being aware of and not working on everything all at once. So I think we need to be better at integrating critiques of toxic masculinity into our other justice work.
I mean, I think I turned to you first, mainly because you also talked about how during the whole movement for women's ordination that there was this feeling among women that they had to be a certain type, and you couldn't talk about sexuality, and you couldn't be open about other parts of your life. It's as if you had to be a certain model that followed this kind of complementary, this is what men do, this is what women do, and so somehow they felt they had to still stay within that model. So that's why I've turned to you first, really.
Because it's a question for John as well, really, because it's really helpful that John comes from a very different theological, I'm once born, brought in, middle of the road background, not conservative evangelical, never, and interestingly, the worlds are quite separate. When I mixed latterly with people of evangelical heritage, conservative or not, I really, like Lausanne, you talk about Lausanne, I remember that rose in my background. I thought, maybe this is something I want to go to. Oh my God, no. Go to places like that, because it was evangelical and conservative heritage. So just one example, I think, from our current mission and evangelism world is work around men's ministry, men's breakfasts, evangelism to men in the pub, how much of that plays into the whole binary. Wouldn't go as far as saying it's toxic, but maybe in some places it is, because there were certainly people I encountered in the Diocese of Oxford who I would say exhibited toxic masculinity in the way they wanted to attract men to the church based on very unhelpful gender stereotypes. Like, men want, we need to preach Jesus as a real man if we want men to come to church. And by real man, I'm quoting, by real man, they mean, we used to joke, did they want pornography at the back of the church? It was that they want men who are strong and they go out and get stuff. And that's the Jesus they wanted to, that's what they wanted to see in Jesus in order to attract more men to church. So that would be kind of one practical example, I think, of ways in which toxic masculinity may be sneaking under our radar, because we notice suddenly that the church has become feminized, because it's full of older women, and that's a bad thing. So John, sorry, I'm talking too much.
Yes, John, we'll turn to you now.
Yeah, I think it's a huge subject, toxic masculinity. A PhD, I think you could write several PhDs on different perspectives on it. As I was thinking about the way that stories of the hero are so often told, particularly in the media, and one where the hero actually comes from a place of weakness, is the whole Harry Potter series, with Harry as a baby who survives, and Voldemort as this stereotypical evil Dark Lord. And I think part of the way I would like us to retell stories of the hero, it's not as the successful person. I planted 5 churches, therefore I know what I'm about and I'm the expert. But the voices that say, I tried to plant a church in a rundown council estate in an ex-mining village and I couldn't do it. That actually might be a better story to tell, because the person has been faithful to what they believed God was saying to them. They've tried to do it, and faithfulness is more important than success in God's sight. Jesus, the danger, I think, and I think Alison picked this up, is that we create the Jesus that mirrors our own prejudice. And certainly there are aspects of Jesus where he fits the stereotypical male, but they're few and far between. Most of the vignettes of Jesus that we read about are of Jesus breaking stereotypes and doing things differently. And I think part of the crucial factor is for men, but also for women, to return to the narratives of Jesus and try and let those narratives shape our understanding of what it should mean to be a follower, to be a man, to be a woman. And that's hard work, because we have to deliberately try and not create the Jesus that confirms our already existing biases. And I can think of festivals for men, for example, where all the stereotypes are echoed. Big screens for watching the sport on a Saturday afternoon. There's the bar. There's physical contact games that are organised, and then you've got these powerful men who can preach the message, and that does not appeal to me, because it plays into a stereotype that exists. And I understand the missional motivations there about trying to appeal to subcultures that exist. But my concern is that it just reinforces stereotypes, that actually the stereotypes themselves need questioning and need challenging. And there must be ways, I think, that we can do that. So I think one of them is having the courage to call out evil and sin when we see it. So in the context of safeguarding, I think we need to have a much more robust way of whistleblowing when there's bullying taking place. And I'm thinking not just of the church leader in a church who bullies congregation. I'm thinking of the way that they can be bullied from above as well. And the hierarchical models of leadership, where we could actually see a much greater leveling out. And I think also acknowledgement that men can be victims too, in the sense that it takes effort and it takes time to reflect upon the way that, as a man, that we're brought up in our culture. And not everybody has the freedom, the resources to do that reflection. And they are victims, or can become victims, of the stereotypes that they've absorbed just by being brought up, and be unaware of their own toxicity and need help to escape from it. And it's a complex thing, because I think there's cultural aspects, family dynamics, socio-political dynamics, all the things that Alison listed earlier, reinforce the stereotypes. And we need to find ways of counteracting the false stereotypes. Yeah. And my view, let's look to Jesus and let Jesus shape us.
Thank you, John. You're reminding me of a book I read not that long ago. I think it's called How Not to Be a Boy. It's written by a comedian. His last name is Webb. I want to say Rupert Webb, but it's How Not to Be a Boy, and it goes through in his own personal narrative exactly the kind of things that you're talking about. So we've got one more question. I'm going to read it slowly because I think it'll need some thinking about. Can someone be organizationally transgressive as a process to challenge power in church mission arenas, such as disadvantaged communities? Would you like me to read that again? Yeah. Can someone be organizationally transgressive as a process to challenge power in church mission arenas, such as in disadvantaged communities? So who'd like to go first? Alison, you've got it.
Yeah, I like that question. And if I've understood it correctly, I think John has already begun to explore some of the issues that are at stake there. So what I understand by that is that there will be a normative organizational approach to certain kinds of work. So and being transgressive is challenging those normative ways of doing whatever it is. And in this case, it would be, okay, how do we do mission in so-called disadvantaged communities? So the conventional narrative is these are communities of lack. They are communities of scarcity. They are communities that have needs. And we are the heroes, the leaders, who are going to take something to these communities, help these communities, develop these communities. That's deeply ingrained in so much of our mission. Anne Morrissey's problematized it. More recently, Al Barrett and Ruth Harley's brilliant book, Being Interrupted, challenges it. Community organizing methodologies, which I'm familiar with, challenge it, because they say communities are about people in relationship. Enable the voices of the people who are in relationship to come first. See what emerges. Then work from there. And actually, people have all sorts of ways of living their lives. The other transgressive thing, I guess, is something like, what is it called? AI, AE, appreciative inquiry, anyway, AI, the other kind. So you go into that. I was in a conversation about church planting once, where somebody came to the meeting and they were big in church planting. And they said, what we do is we get a team of people from one church. And I remember, because it's printed on it, they said, they need to be people who have no needs of their own and no vulnerabilities of their own. They go and live in a community, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, how can that be a model of mission? Who are these people that have no needs of their own and no vulnerabilities? And what are they taking to a disadvantaged community, or whether that's a disadvantaged community in the sense of socioeconomic wider community, or a disadvantaged church community because a church community is perceived of not having the wherewithal to survive and grow because basically it doesn't fit our structures for what a church is and what a church must have and how a church must work and how a church must organize itself. So yeah, I think, so the transgressive models are about by going with an assumption, and what does going even mean? Working in those places, if you're a salaried minister or whatever, as somebody who assumes this is a community of people with gifts, with vision, with people that want to contribute, that have stuff to offer, and that want to be part of the mission of God, finding where God is at work in that community. And that's an entirely different model. But a lot of our church structures now that have funds for particular things, that need particular results in particular spaces of time, have no space for that. So a lot of, in the Anglican context would be whatever that strategic development fund thing is, it's what do we measure, and what does that say about our values, and how transgressive are those values actually? Are they just a replication of neoliberal capitalism, or are they something countercultural, to use John's words?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. And John, turning to you.
Yeah, when we moved to Switzerland to work with the World Council of Churches, I spent 2 weeks in Cuba as part of my job, and I met with representatives, face-to-face meetings with representatives from all mainline Christian churches that existed within Cuba at that time. And they all told me very different stories that had very similar underlying categorizations. They'd all survived a period of sometimes quite active persecution, sometimes passive persecution, where, for example, that at most they were permitted to conduct worship services or religious ceremonies solely within the four walls of the building, not even in a car park or a church property, only within the building. All the church leaders I spoke to, using different criteria, all talked about having growing churches, and some of that growth was really quite impressive. Salvation Army, I think that they just had a commissioning service which where the number of leaders they had gone from 40 to 60, something of that order. So that's significant growth. 50% growth in the number of leaders in a 5-year, 10-year period is very significant. So and what all of these different churches were doing in their different ways was engaging with the genuine felt needs of their communities. in all sorts of ways: youth work, community work, urban gardens, 12-step programs, caring for old people, you know, Meals on Wheels type of stuff for the old people, anything that would help people's lives be improved, that were within the ability of the congregation to deliver. Why? Not because it was a church growth strategy, but because there was genuine human need, and the resources that the church could bring were just that little bit additional to the resources available within the community itself. And so by pairing up with the community, the resources get multiplied. You know, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And there, I think you actually have the biblical model for what really good evangelism looks like, because it's not about trying to convert people. It's about loving people wherever they are, in whatever mess that they might have made of their own lives, or the mess that might have been forced upon them by socio-political factors. And just getting alongside and loving and serving and caring. And the growth takes care of itself. It's not a strategy for growth. It's a strategy for allowing God's kingdom to flourish. And as soon as God's kingdom flourishes, growth happens. And I was reading the book Rodney Stark, The Rise of Christianity at the time. And it's a book that, again, made a very powerful impact, because the two experiences, the book and the trip to Cuba, coincided. And the way Rodney Stark does it, he looked at the growth of the early church from Pentecost to when it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And he tried, as a sociologist, to identify the factors that helped the church to grow. And they were factors like caring for the sick, taking in abandoned baby girls, really basic things that made a huge difference. And I wish we had more of that going in, that looked at genuine human need and simply tried to meet it. And God takes care of the growth. And I think if we could have that perspective as a primary perspective of the church, how do we just care for the people around us? Then people, you know, the preachers like me, our job would be so much easier, because the reality of what the faith does for people, I wouldn't have to try and persuade people of that, because it would be lived out day by day in community, if people love their neighbours. You know, I think we get sidetracked in the mission world. We get sidetracked by grand strategies. But the grand strategy that Jesus gave us was love one another.
There you go. Thank you. Right, I'm aware we have 5 minutes before we have to close off, so I'm going to ask for just a couple of quick sentences from each of you to answer one more question. Do our churches take gender justice seriously? Just a couple of sentences each. Who'd like to go first? John.
Yeah, I'll go first this time. I would be inclined to say basically no, as a sweeping generalization. We don't take gender justice seriously enough. But it's got to start with me. I have to take it much more seriously than I have to date, because I think it's a vital thing. And I'm the father of 2 daughters. They need to have a better world to grow up in.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Alison.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the church doesn't take gender justice seriously enough because it doesn't take power seriously enough, either between individuals, although any individual is always part of structures. So I think the understanding of how power operates through structures and systems is not understood or challenged in the systematic way at different levels that it needs to be.
Thank you, Alison. So, so it's about us or me. I need to take it seriously. All of us need to take it seriously, but also there's an element there of being transgressive and holding power to hold, you know, speaking truth to power, as it were. So, well, there we are. Can I say thank you to you both? Gosh, it's been a real privilege to listen to you, and this is a wonderful start to what we are looking forward to being a whole series of these kind of conversations. So I'm going to do another little sales for the first book that started it out, Her Faith Matters. There'll be a link on the Facebook page for where you can get the book, but just go on the Churches Together, CTBI, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland website and look it up, and there you'll come to the link. But yeah, thank you both. Alison, could I get you to maybe read through the covenant again for us? Because I think in the light of everything we've been talking about, that feels very appropriate.
Right. Sorry, it was on my iPad, so I'm just waking it up.
Yeah, I've put you on the spot now, haven't I?
I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Rank me with whom you will. Put me to doing. Put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you, exalted for you or brought low for you. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. And now, glorious and blessed God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you are mine and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant now made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So I think at this point we need to say goodbye, say farewell to all of those who've joined us online. Thank you. And we look forward to the next one.